Greetings. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and welcome back to another chapter of Magic in Theory and Practice. Today's chapter 4, the Formula of Elohim and That of ALIM. This chapter opens with a quote, so I will do likewise, quoting and expounding upon it. Quote, Elohim is the exoteric word for gods. Gods are the forces of nature. Their names are the laws of nature. Thus they are eternal, omnipotent, omnipresent, and so on. And thus their wills are immutable and absolute. End quote. By the Hermetic Kabbalah of the Golden Dawn, Elohim was Bina before the fall of Eden. Then Yod-He-Vav-He was placed in the abyss, and the divine name of Bina became Yod-He-Vav-He Elohim. But speaking of before the fall, when Bina, the mother, synonymously Elohim, was the first sphere above the spheres of which Adam and Eve would come to rule, namely everything below the supernal realm. This is why in the Torah it is Elohim, who are basically the angels of Abrahamic religions, are the ones to create man and woman. Essentially, the light of Ein Sof, this ultimate nothingness, created the first Aima Elohim, who was conjoined with Jehovah. They were one being, androgynous, who, after the first sin of Adam and Eve, would split into two beings, Elohim and Yod-He-Vav-He. This is written verbatim in the Garden of Eden before the fall. Quote, at the summit are the three supernal Sephiroth, summed up into one, Aima Elohim, the supernal mother, the woman of the apocalypse, clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head the crown of 12 stars. It is written, so the name Jehovah is joined to the name Elohim, where Jehovah planted a garden eastward in Eden. End quote. So what I'm saying is that there is a process here which I am outlining to give a full in-depth analysis of Elohim. At first there was only the nothingness we call the light. Then it became Aima Elohim. It created the world, and then mankind in its image. Somewhere between all of this, the angels too were created, for there is biblical proof there were other spiritual entities around before mankind. But regardless, mankind eats from the tree of knowledge, and Aima Elohim dissolves itself, the Elohim remaining in Bina and Yod-He-Vav-He sealing the abyss, though Jah remains the divine name of Chachma as well. Suppose it is like the fire-water seeds, which copulate and become Yod-He-Vav-He, as Vav and He final do indeed usher forth from Yod-He. In summary, the light goes through many permutations above and below the abyss, rearranging by necessity until stability was achieved and the world could spin and grow into what it is today. Also that Jehovah is the divine name sealing the abyss. It makes sense that man took on a paternal figurehead for Christianity, for I suppose the ancient adepts who organized all of these allegories could not conquer the mind, and looking up, saw only the falsity of the abyss, and assumed that that was the highest, much like Adam and Eve foretook the demiurgos to be the true God in the garden, not able to attain the supernal realm themselves at that time. So moving on with the chapter, quote, gods are the forces of nature, end quote. How I see it, gods, angels, what have you, are both objective and subjective beings simultaneously. They exist independently of the human mind, and our perception as actual forces of the universe are but are beyond the physicality of it all. They are very much space, minuteness, heat, friction, love, anger, etc. But they are also personifications, our perceptions of such forces made into beings, given images that we can analyze, and to whom we gave allegorical mythologies to explain the specific forces which they represent. Quote, their names are the laws of nature, end quote. I see not much difference than the previous explanation, but I will go a different route and comment further thus. The angels, deities, spirits are governed by their names, which we have given them, much as the letter makes up their names have correspondences which represent various ideas. This is why the name of a being or a class of being can easily help shape its image. James Eshelman explains this idea in his Pearls of Wisdom when explaining the Star Ruby ritual. The Chaldean oracle entities, which are called to the circle in this ritual, do not have a definite personage and shape attached to them. If they once did, it was lost in time. But he explains that when calling them, you could take the letters of their names and give them an image that way. So, for example, Daimonos is in the north, Let's go through its name really quick. Daimanos. D corresponds with the moon, so it is a horned entity with a crescent moon on its head, or just any type of horns like Pan. A, the second letter of its name, is air, and androgynous, describing its face. I is the male seed, so it gives the entity a more masculine body. M is water, so perhaps it has breasts, or perhaps it indicates the hangman Odin, thus the entity has a beard. O is Ayin, the devil, so we have a satyr indicated, half man, half goat, hoofed and hairy. N is Scorpio, ruled by Mars and darkly sexual. O again, reinforcing the erect phallus of Priapus, the gnarled oak. And S, Sagittarius, can indicate the bow and arrow which perhaps this entity carries. This is by no means a definite visual of this class of entity, but it is an example of how a name carries correspondences. So aside from its image, the name corresponds with what power the entity has. Crowley explains etymology in Magick Without Tears and the Book of Thoth. Quote, Zadi is the natural letter of the emperor in the original phonetic system, as shown in the words Tsar, Kaiser, Caesar, Senor, Sigur, Seflor, Senor, Sir, end quote. So do you see the connection between names and law now? To continue, Elohim, quote, is the masculine plural of a feminine noun, but its nature is principally feminine. It represents Sakti or Te. Femininity always means form, manifestation. The masculine Shiva or Tao is always a concealed force. It is a perfect hieroglyph of the number 5. The elements are all represented as in Tetragrammaton, but there is no development from one into the others. They are, as it were, thrown together, untamed, only sympathizing by virtue of their wild and stormy but elastically resistless energy. The center letter is He, the letter of breath, and represents spirit. The first letter Aleph is the natural letter of air, and the final Mem is the natural letter of water. Together Aleph and Mem make Am, the mother, within whose womb the cosmos is conceived. But Yod is not a natural letter of fire. Its juxtaposition here with He sanctifies that fire to the Yod of Tetragrammaton. Similarly, we find Lamed for earth, where we should expect Tao in order to emphasize the influence of Venus who rules Libra, end quote. The value of Elohim by Gematria is 86. Firstly, in connection with the previous paragraph in Libra 58, we should look at the number 14 first. Quote, 14, an elaboration of 5, 1 plus 4 equals 5. Force, a concentration of the number 86, 8 plus 6 equals 14. Elohim, the 5 elements, end quote. So we have major evidence that here that Pentagrammaton is baked into Elohim. Turning briefly to the Equinox Volume 1 and Note on Genesis, Elohim is mentioned with some very interesting factors. Quote, as in the midst of the letters of the verse we saw the words ALHIM, H-I-M, thou an extension. So also does the name Elohim read El, deity, Him, an extension. And the numeration of Elohim is 86, which by Gematria reads He, Aleph, Pe, again meaning spread out, extended. Write the letters of the name in any invoking pentagram, and the banishing pentagram thereof will read 3.1415 by Kabbalah of 9 chambers, which is the formula of the proportion of diameter to the circumference of the circle, end quote. So we have conks on pox, and the circle too baked into Elohim, all the first cause and the being that is an effect of it. If the point about pi 3.1415 is confusing, look at this illustration. We write the letters in the order of an earth-invoking pentagram, and then read it back by the order of a banishing pentagram. The numbers do correspond, which I think is a great find by Crowley. So also, in Liber 500, there are several very interesting words in the grouping under 86, but I'll just point out one. That being Ehiyah Adonai. These are the divine names of Kether and Malkuth. Thus, we have the Azoth formula loosely intertwined with Elohim as well. In all ways, it really indicates the ability to extend the light and create all things. Not yet mentioned, Elohim is a masculine plural of a feminine word, so it indicates androgyny, as it is essentially Bina, and even though Bina is the mother, all things in the supernal realm are in unity, so while the feminine is form, it conceals the Tao within it, much like the Lingam Yoni. Elohim as pentagrammaton also makes sense in that the seeds of the elements are all in Kether and birthed through Bina from the seed of Chachma. Elohim bestows the light, sending it forth downward like the lightning bolt to condense into physical matter. Quote, "It is the breath of benediction, yet so potent that it can give life to clay and light to darkness." End quote. This is why in the Bible it is Elohim and not any other divine name which makes mankind. The light must be sent through the mother. I would think that the Kabbalists who worked the magic of the golem used the formula of Elohim to bring life to the clay. Crowley analyzes each letter further. The A is the lightning strike and Holy Ghost, literally the spirit which takes up residence in the body, and Lamed, the ox goat, which whips the matter into life. It is, quote, the driving force, end quote, and also the scales of balance, the duality which is necessary for existence, life, and death. It pushes the wheel of samsara forward. Quote, Yod is the creative energy, the procreative power, and yet Yod is the solitude and silence of the hermitage into which the magician has shut himself, end quote. Yod, which is seated in Chachma as the creative seed, once the light descends, is also the seed in the very center of one's being, the Ka in the Kabs in the Ku. It is the light reminiscent, one's connection with the divine, concealed, much like the hermit under the outer robe of concealment. Quote, Mem is the letter of water, and it is the Mem final, whose long flat line suggests the sea at peace, end quote. Thus, the life force flowing through one, prana, chi, the astral light, etc. And in the midst of all this is He, which aforesaid is spirit, breath, the root of vibration, that which animates. Using the formula as a magician is the act of consecration. When one bestows their magical weapons with the light, they are essentially invoking the power of Elohim. It is because we are made in their image that we have the power to do as they did, bestowing the light and life of the divine upon an inanimate object, making it holy and giving it the ability to function. Before moving on, I want to just analyze the word Elohim in a different manner. First off, in Liber 777, under column 187, Magical Formula, Elohim is the formula of Path 5, Gebora, which is Mars. This sphere in Thelemic initiation is one of mastering magic in the AN. Mars itself is a sphere that, as the symbol of males, is both active and thus forceful, having the power to exude influence externally. It is also situated in the feminine pillar of the tree, giving it a balance in that way. Notes in the back of 777 to column 187 refer the reader to the Heart of the Master by Crowley, where other magical formula coupled with the bird are given for the spheres 1 through 9. Gebora is given the hawk and Ate Gebor Leolam Adonai, Agla. Horus descending upon the earth, much like the opening of Liber Zadi, can be thought then in connection with everything said about Elohim for the connection of the active, life-giving powers ascribed to ushering forth the light. So that's one half. That was Elohim. Now Elim. So we look at the formula of Elim, which is minus the He, thus negated spirit. Its geometrical value is 81, 9 times 9 or 9 squared, the moon in duality. Crowley describes it as a eunuch. Ironic, considering its value associating it with the moon, places it in league with Yasod, the phallus of the tree. Other words under the number 81 include I, for which is from Exodus, Anki, here and hither, throne. The most interesting is throne, for what are the 4 elements condensed yet lifeless, bodied throne for the spirit to enter? Also, ap, here, thither, could indicate the fool in the tower, or wandering to or from calamity. And Anki, I associate it with ego. Elim itself means gods, but it is not a positive sense, as, quote, it is thus the formula of witchcraft which is under Hekate, end quote. Now, before anyone gets upset with what I'm going to be talking about on witchcraft, and in this chapter, a negative view of witchcraft, there's nothing wrong with today's practitioners of witchcraft and what they practice. That's fine. Wicca and revivalists calling themselves traditional witchcraft practitioners are not what's being referred to here. What is being referred to is spellcasters who blaspheme their temple, who are corrupted to the point of hating their humanity and desire power to compensate for the shortcomings every person is born with, such as the ability to make mistakes, the frailness of the body, and the fact that we have to die, etc. Moreover, the class Crowley is speaking about are antithetical to Thelema and most of today's self-identified witches. The witchcraft being referred to is one where there is no problem harming others with their magic, even using their rituals to subvert or take away the will of somebody by forcing them to do something via magic. In other words, if somebody's using magic under this formula, they are restricted. So, ALIM, here we have the formula of, quote, the elemental gods deprived of the creative spirit, end quote. Crowley writes that, quote, one might suppose that ALHIM is the masculine plural of the masculine noun El. Its formula would be more virile than that of Elohim, which is the masculine plural of a feminine noun Ale. A moment's investigation is sufficient to dissipate the illusion. The word masculine has no meaning except in relation to some feminine correlative. The word alim may in fact be considered as neuter. By a rather absurd convention, neuter objects are treated as feminine on account of their superficial resemblance, impassivity, and inertness with an unfertilized female. But the female produces life by the intervention of the male, while the neuter does so only when impregnated by spirit. Thus we find the feminine ama becoming ama through the operation of the phallic yod, while alim, the congress of dead elements, only fructifies by the brooding of spirit. Ama is 42, the number of sterility. Ima, 52, that of fertility of Ben, the sun, end quote. So, in other words, LM can affect the four elements, but cannot give life, cannot bestow the light, has no connection with spirit, just the other four elements. It's cut off from the highest. The androgyny is superb in all ways, for it has the power not only to procreate, but to deliver the light, whereas the masculine neuter cannot. It is the spiritual difference between people who embrace, utilize, and hold sacred their sex powers versus an incel alpha male of today's society. Of course, I mean this only in allegory, not in a literal sense. Quote, it is only the romantic medieval perversion of science that represents young women as partaking in witchcraft, which is, properly speaking, restricted to the use of such women as are no longer women in the magical sense of the word, because they are no longer capable of corresponding to the formula of the male, and are therefore neuter rather than feminine themselves. It is for this reason that their method has always been referred to the moon, in the sense of the term in which she appears, not as the feminine correlative of the sun, but as the burnt-out, dead, airless satellite of Earth, end quote. Yes, it goes both ways. A complete being, be they male or female, has united the opposites within themselves. Those of this class can only harness half of the equation. In other words, there is no unity by this formula. Power, yes, anything can have power, but when power is purely intellectual, it lacks. Even there's a quote, if power asks why, then is power weakness, end quote, which you'll recognize from Librel, indicating that not all types of power are good, or if power stops. To paraphrase a bit, this formula is only illusionary. It is absolutely subject to the Maya and can never transcend it. And yes, while initiates of the magic of light, while they're in the lower grades ascending, sometimes the best they can do is only affect matter by rearranging its components, such as doing one's will upon the earth. The difference is when one gains access to the highest and allows their will to function in harmony with the light, they are giving up their ego and becoming absorbed into the whole. Their will and the universal will become one. For those falling under the class of ALIM, they are only doing what they want as opposed to what they will to do. There's a big difference. This chapter ends with a footnote about ALIM alluding to, as I said at the beginning, Yesod, rather than the moon. In this case, it is the function in Crowley's opinion of homosexual sex. In my opinion, he misunderstood the 11th degree of which he is referring to. The proper interpretation is not merely male on male anal sex. It is finding ecstasy in the least favored and most abhorred, be that sex or what have you. Anal sex can align with the idea Crowley posits, as the semen has no womb to fertilize, thus the participants act as neuters. But even such sex can be used to ascend up to the highest, and one's sexuality may be their divine will to do so, making the act different from the idea of ALIM in regards to this chapter. Here, it would be like having anal sex in an attempt to blaspheme the body and profane God. Let us look at the footnote. Quote, Aleph may be referred to Harpocrates, with allusion to the well-known poem of Catullus. Lamed may imply the exaltation of Saturn and suggest the 3 of Swords in a particular manner. Yod will then recall Hermes, and Mem the hangman. Thus we have a tetragrammaton which contains no feminine component. The initial force is here the Holy Spirit and his vehicle or weapon, the, quote, sword and balances. Justice is then done upon the mercurial virgin, with the result that man is hanged or extended and is slain in this manner. Such an operation makes creation impossible, as in the former case, but here there is no question of rearrangement. The creative force is employed deliberately for destruction, and is entirely absorbed in its own sphere or cylinder, on Einstein's equations of action. This work is to be regarded as holiness to the Lord. The great merits of this formula are that it avoids contact with the inferior planes, that it is self-sufficient, that it involves no responsibilities, and that it leaves its masters not only stronger in themselves, but wholly free to fulfill their essential natures. Its abuse is an abomination. End quote. Further, male adepts were encouraged in this method in the Aeon of Osiris, as they were barred from relations with women by oath. It is not a blasphemy, but an act of worship, and cannot be classed with Elohim merely because of the association with Yesod. Further, I find it more suitably corresponds with Malkuth, but I'll spare you my opinions in that regard. So, to close, we have 2 formulas, one that gives life and endows creations with spirit, the other a mere changing of matter to suit one's whims. Both have their place in magic. One can consecrate, the other can cause change. Both have use, but in the grand scheme, the one who has aligned themselves with the way of the Tao will find both far below them. Still, for most, that state of being is far off, and thus all who are new to magic will have to familiarize themselves with the powers of both formulas, even when this familiarity comes packaged and wrapped with different terminology. On to the next chapter. Love is the law, love under will. Catch you in the next one.